What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through how I'm actively building flexibility into every system by designing for optionality. How we're actively thinking about this today so that into the future we can scale it even further. And like always with these videos, the main mission is to build our thinking OS, basically our own internal operating system that allows us to build the backend infrastructure that we're building for our clients, and ultimately taking it to the next level where we're ultimately redefining industries and also inspiring millions of people. So most people build for certainty. I think a lot of people, build in the sense of, they just want to make sure that what it is that they're building, they have certainty to make sure that, hey, each and every single thing is going to work. And this is the tunnel vision that we're going to have in making sure that this one singular thing that we're doing is going to work out. But for me, throughout my journey, I've realized that the true edge comes from designing for optionality. What this basically means is you create systems, habits, and products that let you pivot, scale, or exploit opportunities without being trapped by a single path. I think in many things, that you ultimately have, in terms of building, systems as well, is this mindset of, hey, like we need to just build this rigid system and it's gonna work in this sole factor and nothing else. And this is one of the things that I was having a discussion much earlier about with my team as well, when we were just going through how we're actively looking at a system that we've built and how we can, ultimately pivot it into the future if needs be into a completely different use case. But ultimately, if we did not take this approach of building for optionality and flexibility, we wouldn't be able to, ultimately be able to pivot. And I think this is one of the most important things, especially if you're building out systems and also into the future, that we need to make sure that we're ultimately building with the key design of optionality. Because through optionality, we ultimately create these options that we can ultimately take into the future, because you don't always know if the path that you're taking, in terms of how you're designing your system, and if you don't make it, modular, and you just make it this rigid system that only serves one use case, ultimately, into the future, you may find that, hey, this specific use case that we had it for ultimately is not going to help long term. Ultimately, the business shifts, the business context also shifts, but ultimately we need to make sure that we are building these systems in the manner that we are able to be flexible. And what I mean by this is, hey, let's say we built a sales operating system, or we built a sales system, and through that sales system, we later found out that, hey, this sales system is not actually serving the ROI that it was intended for this specific use case, even though we had the data that said, hey, like this is one of the most important use cases that we had in that present moment in time. But then we realized as they've used it for a month or two, the business context shifts, and then we ultimately realize that, hey, this specific sales OS ultimately needs to encompass, outreach as well. It needs to focus heavily on outreach and less on sales, because that process is already super dialed. And then ultimately just adding on top of that, but ultimately creating that infrastructure that ultimately allows us to, have flexibility in terms of our design. And through this flexibility, it comes down to three things, which is number one, modular design, which is one of the biggest things that I always strive for in everything that we built. Just having this modular design in terms of how we're actively building the vision of Chaos Killer OS, basically saying, hey, we're able to swap each and every moving part without disrupting the whole entire system, and we can improve each and every, part separate from everything else, or even just expand it without breaking its core. Because I think one of the most important, things when you are designing, systems specifically, is to be able to make them modular, such that so that you can swap out parts without breaking the entire core function of the specific, use case that you're building these systems for. Because if you have every single thing bunched up or, dependent on each other, with a high, relationship, in the sense that each and every time that, something breaks, it breaks the entire system, this is ultimately in the long term going to cause a lot of downtime, and ultimately, it's going to cause frustrations as well. And ultimately in the long term, I think, just having this this modular design creates that, that flexibility that we do need, because we can move out these independent parts and also just swap them, and making sure that, hey, this means that future, integrations don't require rebuilding from scratch, so we can actively just integrate and add integrations in our current stack without actively just rebuilding it from scratch. And I think this is one of the most, important things to have a modular design, principle when we're actively building out systems, to say, hey, if XYZ crashes, or in the worst case scenario, it stops working forever, does it affect all the other moving parts while it's still running? And if the answer is yes, then how can we actively, just make it more modular, simply by asking the questions that ultimately allow us to reach a new level of understanding that scales our thinking. And also make sure that, hey, we're thinking from first principles, understanding each and every single moving part and how they interact with each other, because I think through that we gain control of the entire system. And I think, when it comes to building systems and just ultimately, just creating leverage for our clients as well, ultimately giving them the control is ultimately going to be a function that we're actively going to have to, incorporate each and every single day, to say, hey, we need to make sure that we have control of the entire system, because if we don't have control, we ultimately cannot, predict how it's going to act in the future. And recognizing those patterns as well is also going to be a key aspect of it. So ultimately just making sure that each and every single day that we're actively building this system in a way that's modular, but also just is scalable into the future, which leads on to the redundancy and leverage, which I think, ultimately, needs to be layered. And this layering process is so that failure is in one area and it doesn't halt the operation. Because one of the most important things is, if you're actively, just building for a use case, and failure points just happen everywhere, that's ultimately, just gonna break the machine. And ultimately that's not what you want. You want to make sure that you are, thinking in multiple revenue channels, basically multiple revenue pipelines as well, and multiple decision frameworks, so that you're not just tied to one singular point of failure. And I think this one singular point of failure is one of the things that, causes that downtime and also makes the entire machine inefficient. So then the question becomes, how can we actively do this? Which is ultimately, like I said, creating multiple revenue channels, multiple lead pipelines, and multiple decision frameworks. Because if you're actively layering those, you have a, system that is defensible from those small breaks that may happen. And it doesn't break the entire machine, but you also ultimately are able to keep on going, which gives you control as well. Because I think if you have more control over the entire system, the more leverage you're able to create. But also with that leverage, you need to tie in redundancy as well. And through that, you also need to make sure that we're incorporating scenario thinking, which basically says, hey, before we're committing to a strategy, we need to make sure that we're mapping out the best use case, worst case, and plausible pivot paths. And I think, in building systems, this is going to be one of the most important things. I was working on something inside Killer Chaos OS not too long ago, and I was looking at how we can actively build these, scenario based, conclusions, and also these scenario specific, simulations as well. Because I think, in the business context, this is going to create so much leverage into the future if we're just able to, play these simulations that ultimately simulate if XYZ is not solved within that specific time, and also the level and scope of impact that it will have on the business, not even just today, but even in the next 5-10 months. Ultimately, just having that scenario simulation is also ultimately something that we're actively thinking about integrating inside Killer Chaos OS, because I think that will ultimately serve, the businesses that we're going to be working with a ton of value into the future. And this is where optionality, reduces risk by increasing upside. I think one of the most important things is that ultimately increasing the optionality in terms of, creating these simulations as well, these scenario simulations, is that it ultimately gives you a playbook within the internal business infrastructure to say that, hey, if XYZ is breaking, if churn is up, if churn is down, sorry, ultimately you can take XYZ route if you run the simulation, and you ultimately do that inside Killer Chaos OS. And I think this is going to be, a very tall, thing to ultimately build. But ultimately, I think it's going to yield so much value that why not? Why not just go for it and just build it, because it has insane amounts of value. And right now we just want to make sure that we're building it right and figuring out all the, tiny little details that ultimately allows us to then build the vision of Killer Chaos into the future. But why this ultimately matters comes down to three things. And this is, flexibility gives you speed, which means I can deploy new ideas faster than competitors tied to rigid systems, because in business, speed is everything. Ultimately, being able to do things right there and then ultimately gives you that leverage that, hey, your competition cannot match your pace simply because they have rigid systems, and you have this modular approach that gives you optionalities. And ultimately, through that, you ultimately have that competitive advantage that allows you to scale over your competitors. And through that, you also, make sure that, hey, through the resilience, you also have confidence. And what this means is that with optionality, it allows me to take bold moves without fear of catastrophic failure. Each and every time that, we have resilience within ourselves as well, we ultimately have confidence, because we know that we can take massive risks and we won't face catastrophic failures because we've planned for it as well, which is also super important. And I think optionality also gives you that, because hey, if you fail or you catastrophically fail, quote unquote, you're able to, have these options that, hey, we can take a step back, but ultimately the damage won't be as severe as it would have been if we didn't have these at play. And through this, we ultimately have leverage, which ultimately means you're experiencing exponential growth. And why this matters is that each system I build now compounds because it's designed to adapt. And I think adaptability is one of those things that we're ultimately going to have to be striving for on a day-to-day basis, to make sure that, hey, our system can survive the most stress testing times, and we're also ultimately able to constantly refine it as well, so that it's not just a build once and it's done just like that. We just are ultimately building it once and then ultimately refining it as we go, because I think it's going to create so much leverage and so much ROI for our clients that we're going to be working with into the future. And also making sure that, hey, each and every single day we're making sure that our clients are experiencing leverage and also resilience as well as flexibility through these modes of optionality. And through this design of flexibility that ultimately creates this optionality, I think into the future it's going to create insane amounts of value that we can ultimately scale for our clients. But this ultimately means that high level builders don't just execute, they create spaces for opportunities to appear. So one of the things that I think, just having and designing for optionality is ultimately you create opportunities as you go. You could build, XYZ platform, and through that platform you realize that, hey, there's more opportunities. But if you built a rigid system that only solves one specific use case and you aren't able to pivot as fast as your competition, you ultimately don't have that leverage. You ultimately cannot be playing at the level that you're supposed to be playing within your business infrastructure. And I think that's one of the modes that, I want to make sure that we're constantly striving for on a day-to-day basis, to making sure that, hey, we're building for optionality. We're making sure that, hey, even if we quote unquote fail catastrophically, we have options that we can take that ultimately allow us to get to the end goal, and also create new opportunities for different end goals, because you never know. You never know what is guaranteed into the future. You can only just plan and predict for it and say, hey, if we plan for worst case scenario and map it out, and also plan for best case scenario and map it out as well, we can ultimately have a document or just a space where we ultimately understand, hey, this is the best case scenario that could possibly happen, and this is the worst case scenario that could possibly happen, and how can we actively just strive more leaning towards the more best case scenario. But ultimately, if that best case scenario does not work out and we ultimately end up on the worst case scenario, how much do we have to lose? And I think, just planning for it and creating that realm of optionality is ultimately going to be our modes that we're actively going to be driving each and every single day. But through this, it means that optionality turns unpredictability into advantage. And I think just ultimately creating this unfair advantage within your own business infrastructure is one of the most important things that we can actively, make sure that we're building for our clients as well. And into the future, like I always say, we're gonna fail so many times, but the things that we are gonna hit, we're gonna make sure that we do it right, and that we're taking the time to making sure that we're building the vision of Killer Chaos OS into the future that we see it being. And I'm super excited to continue to build, the vision of Killer Chaos OS each and every single day. I'm inspired, just think about the level of impact, that, Killer Chaos OS will have in the future, where we're inspiring millions of people and we're also redefining industries and having a large amount of impact. And I think that is a future worth getting excited for, and a future to wake up each and every single day to build. And if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.